You might picture Princess Margaret as the sparkling royal who breezed through parties with a cigarette holder in one hand and a cocktail in the other. And you wouldn't be entirely wrong. She was an icon of glamour, charisma, and rebellious wit, seeming to relish every spotlight that came her way. Yet behind the glitzy headlines and stunning gowns lay a life shaped by upheaval, heartbreak, and a constant tussle between personal desire and royal duty. People sometimes call her the rebel princess, or say she was royalty's first true modern celebrity. But Margaret was far more complicated than any nickname could ever convey. Today, let's settle into a warm conversation and explore her story from beginning to end. The highs, the lows, the laughter, the tears, and the legacy she left on the royal stage. If you can imagine the hush of early morning in a sprawling Scottish castle, that's the setting for Margaret's very first moments on Earth. She was born at Glamis Castle on August 21st, 1930, making her the first royal baby born in Scotland in some 3 centuries. Her parents were the Duke and Duchess of York. Margaret was their second child. Her elder sister Elizabeth was already in line to inherit a significant royal role. At the time, though, Margaret's birth felt like a cheerful addition rather than a monumental event. After all, no one could have predicted the constitutional crisis that would soon overturn the monarchy's hierarchy. For those first few years, Margaret was free to toddle around and develop a mischievous personality in relative obscurity. Her birth name was Margaret Rose. Some in the family took to calling her Bud, a nod to her middle name Rose, and her budding, vibrant nature. Staff at Glamis Castle recounted stories of how, even as an infant, Margaret had an uncanny knack for giggling at the most unexpected moments. She seemed to sparkle with curiosity about her surroundings, tracking each new face with those bright eyes. By the time she could walk and talk, she was known for greeting visitors with such exuberance that palace staff had to remind her to maintain proper form for a princess. But the word proper never really resonated with Margaret. As the years passed, she kept that irreverent streak, which both charmed and scandalized courtiers. In 1936, Margaret was only 6 when her uncle, King Edward VIII, chose love over the crown, abdicating to marry Wallis Simpson. This put Margaret's shy father on the throne as King George VI. Consequently, her sister Elizabeth became next in line to rule, and Margaret was suddenly second in line, albeit with an understanding that the spare rarely ascends the throne unless calamity befalls the heir. The move to Buckingham Palace changed Margaret's life overnight. Gone were the more relaxed days of being just the York family's second daughter. Now she was Her Royal Highness Princess Margaret, living in the grandest palace in England, learning to wave to crowds, and standing beside her sister during public appearances. Despite the formality swirling around her, Margaret stayed playful. People who spent time with the princesses noted how Margaret's sense of humor lit up even the stiff corridors of the palace. During children's parties, she was the one making up silly games or poking fun at stuffy traditions. One anecdote has Margaret coaxing an entire group of young guests to sneak a tray of pastries into a quiet corner, effectively escaping the watchful eyes of their nannies. This spark carried her through the uncertainties of her father's new reign. Historians say the king found in Margaret a bit of himself. He admired her lively persona, calling her "my joy," while acknowledging Elizabeth as "my pride." That distinction would loom over Margaret her entire life. Her sister was the serious one, destined to become queen, while Margaret was the free spirit who kept everyone on their toes. When World War II erupted, Margaret was not yet 10. She and Elizabeth were moved around for safety reasons, sometimes staying at Windsor Castle away from the Blitz in London. Childhood in wartime was starkly different from the typical royal upbringing. Still, Margaret managed to find pockets of fun. She famously performed pantomimes, musical plays at Windsor, entertaining staff and occasionally raising morale among the people who sheltered with the royals. Though the war overshadowed her adolescence, these performances revealed her flair for the theatrical. Margaret was said to love singing, dancing, and playing the piano. In fact, she developed into quite a fine pianist over the years. One friend recalled that she could sit down at a party, strike up a Gershwin tune, and bring the entire room to hush in admiration. Margaret's teen years coincided with Britain's post-war rebuilding, a time of rationed books and national austerity. But as a princess, she had more luxuries than the average citizen could dream of, even if the monarchy tried to show solidarity by making small sacrifices. Still, Margaret's vantage point was unusual. There she was, in a newly redefined monarchy, watching as her father King George VI took on the heavy burdens of leadership. Meanwhile, her elder sister Elizabeth, with all eyes upon her, began stepping confidently into future queen duties. Margaret remained the spare, an official role, yes, but a confusing one. She had responsibilities, yet was not the center of monarchy. Historians often note that this ambiguous space nurtured her rebellious streak and gave her a sense that she could at least attempt to chart her own path, however stifling the system might be. Tragedy struck in 1952 when King George VI passed away from complications related to lung cancer. Margaret was 21 at the time and devastated. She had adored her father, seeing in him a gentle presence that balanced the stiff protocols. His death thrust Elizabeth onto the throne as Queen Elizabeth II. For Margaret, life felt as though the ground had shifted. If being the spare was awkward before, it now left her truly directionless in the eyes of the monarchy. She loved her sister, but she also felt overshadowed by the crown's gravity. The British press fixated on Elizabeth's coronation in 1953, leaving Margaret to navigate her grief and uncertainty somewhat outside of the spotlight, at least momentarily. Then along came Group Captain Peter Townsend, a former Royal Air Force pilot who served as an equerry to the royal household. He'd been a decorated war hero, known for his bravery in the Battle of Britain. Tall, courteous, and steady, Townsend was also married with children. That didn't stop Margaret from falling in love. Exactly how and when their romance began remains a subject of speculation. What's clear is that by the early 1950s, rumors were swirling that Margaret and Townsend were becoming far more than friendly acquaintances. They seemed in many ways an unlikely pair. Margaret was known for her brash humor and flamboyance, while Townsend was quieter, deeply disciplined. Yet they fit together in ways that Margaret, starved for genuine affection after her father's death, craved. In 1953, Townsend divorced his wife, fueling intense speculation that Margaret and Peter intended to marry. The press latched onto the story, a princess in love with a divorced man at a time when the Church of England still officially frowned upon divorce and remarriage. The monarchy was reeling from the abdication fiasco of Edward VIII less than 2 decades earlier, so the notion of another scandal shook the corridors of Buckingham Palace. Polls suggested that many everyday Britons actually supported Margaret's right to marry Townsend, but politicians and palace officials were less enthused. They worried about constitutional ramifications, the Queen's position as head of the church, and the broader international image of the royal family. Despite negotiations and possible behind-the-scenes deals, Margaret announced in October 1955 that she would not marry Townsend. She cited her devotion to the church and her loyalty to the monarchy. That statement was a bombshell. She was only 25, deeply in love, and forced to renounce her personal happiness in deference to a system that demanded a squeaky clean image. Biographers say Margaret cried for weeks afterward, haunted by what might have been. Even Townsend, who'd held out hope that they could wed, gracefully bowed out and eventually remarried someone else. Close friends noticed a marked change in Margaret's behavior in the aftermath. That spark of mischief she'd carried since childhood got sharper, more reckless. It was as though her heartbreak had hardened into a subtle defiance. By the late 1950s, Margaret had become a fashion icon, an image bolstered by her slender figure, dramatic dresses, and a penchant for glamorous parties. But she wasn't just a showpiece for the tabloids. She actually participated in various royal engagements, from christenings to state functions. In 1958, she embarked on her first major tour outside of Europe, traveling to places like the Caribbean, where thousands of people lined the streets to catch a glimpse of her. Even in these official capacities, Margaret was known for witty, often borderline, sarcastic remarks that left some guests charmed and others flustered. A Jamaican newspaper described her as the most captivating combination of regal grace and spirited laughter, a telling reflection of how her personality could disarm you if you were open to it. In 1959, Margaret's life took another turn when she reconnected with Anthony Armstrong Jones, Tony as he was nicknamed, a society photographer with a creative streak as wide as the River Thames. He was bohemian, at ease among artists, and seemingly unawed by Margaret's title. It's been said that Tony photographed Margaret in informal settings, capturing her playful side in a way that no official portrait had managed. Their relationship blossomed. In a surprise move, Margaret and Tony announced their engagement in 1960, stunning the press, who hadn't even realized they were dating. They married at Westminster Abbey, an event broadcast on live television to millions. This was a groundbreaking moment. It was the first royal wedding to be televised, and it catapulted Margaret into an unprecedented spotlight. People around the globe watched, enchanted by her regal attire and the sense of modern love cutting through centuries of royal tradition. Their marriage seemed promising at first. They had 2 children, David, born in 1961, later styled Viscount Linley and eventually the 2nd Earl of Snowdon, and Sarah, born in 1964, styled Lady Sarah Chatto. The couple mingled with high society, but also with the swinging London set. Fashion designers, rock stars, photographers, and actors. Their home, Kensington Palace Apartment 10, became a hub for glamorous gatherings. Tony's friends introduced Margaret to a more bohemian circle than any royal had dared step into before. This cultural bridging brought a breath of fresh air to the monarchy's public image, showing that royals could be in touch with the fast-moving trends of the 1960s. Yet behind the scenes, friction built. Margaret's quick temper and Tony's rumored infidelities gnawed at the marriage. They argued about everything: her chain smoking, his late-night photographic sessions, her thirst for attention, his preference for independence. Both of them embarked on extramarital affairs, feeding the tabloids more sensational stories. Margaret was labeled the party princess. Her late-night forays into London clubs widely reported. The couple's once lively social life devolved into tense gatherings. Friends recounted uncomfortable dinners where Margaret would sip a strong gin and unleash biting remarks while Tony retreated into moody silence. That tension spilled into the public eye. By the late 1960s and early 1970s, photos of Margaret in the tabloids had lost their carefree sparkle. Instead, she appeared tight-lipped or curt, as if bracing herself for a barrage of questions. Gossip columns ran wild with speculation about an impending divorce, something scandalous in royal circles. Meanwhile, the monarchy itself faced changing times. Britain was becoming less deferential to aristocracy, and sensational tabloids thrived on royal missteps. Margaret's personal drama became fodder for a public increasingly eager to see the cracks in the gilded facade. In 1976, Margaret and Tony separated, and they officially divorced in 1978, the first royal divorce to command significant attention since Henry VIII's era. The Queen was said to be sympathetic but also disappointed, having hoped that Margaret might salvage the marriage. Nevertheless, the divorce was a relief for Margaret in some respects. She no longer had to keep up appearances with a husband she was barely speaking to. Yet it was also a personal failure she carried heavily, a disappointment to a monarchy that held itself up as a paragon of stability. While her marriage crumbled, Margaret's rebellious side found a new lease on life through her relationship with Roddy Llewellyn, a landscape gardener 17 years her junior. They met around 1973, when Margaret was in her early 40s and Roddy in his mid-20s. The tabloids, as you can imagine, exploded. Photographs of Margaret and Roddy lounging in swimsuits on the Caribbean island of Mustique set off a firestorm of public disapproval and voyeuristic fascination. Many older Britons were shocked at seeing a prominent royal consorting so openly with a younger lover, but some younger citizens viewed it as an oddly relatable human moment. Here was a princess simply trying to find happiness, albeit in a scandalous manner. Margaret's emotional well-being during this period was precarious. She drank heavily, favoring whiskey and gin, and chain-smoked cigarettes, up to 60 a day by some counts. Friends grew worried about her health, especially as she began to complain of migraines and other ailments. In 1985, she underwent a partial lung removal operation, following years of smoking-related issues. The press reported it thoroughly, ironically shining a spotlight on the consequences of her lifestyle. Yet Margaret rarely expressed regret. She quipped more than once, "I've never done anything by halves, darling." That swagger was undeniably part of her allure, even if it exacted a steep price physically and emotionally. Despite her personal tribulations, Margaret continued to fulfill royal duties. She supported various charities, including those focused on ballet and the arts. She was president of the Royal Ballet for many years. In a way, her role within the family remained that of a supporting player, appearing at events that the Queen or other senior royals couldn't attend. She traveled to former British colonies to celebrate their independence or to strengthen diplomatic ties. Though overshadowed by her own controversies, she could be gracious and warm at official functions, displaying a keen memory for names and faces. Some have said that if you met Princess Margaret at a garden party, you'd leave thinking you just spent time with someone who genuinely cared about your story, so long as you didn't catch her in one of her famously unpredictable moods. By the 1990s, Margaret's health deteriorated further. A series of strokes in the late 90s and early 2000s left her partially paralyzed, and she also suffered vision problems. The once feared Snow Queen, with the sharp tongue, had softened into a more reclusive figure, often seen in a wheelchair or walking with difficulty. When she did appear publicly, sometimes with the Queen, at events like the Queen Mother's 100th birthday celebrations, the press noted how frail she seemed. Yet Margaret retained her sense of style, her hair perfectly coiffed, her nails impeccably done, and clung to a vestige of the independence she cherished. Princess Margaret passed away on February 9, 2002, after yet another stroke. She died at King Edward VII's Hospital in London, age 71. Just weeks later, on March 30th, her mother, the beloved Queen Mother, also passed away at age 101. The loss of these two figures in such quick succession brought a wave of collective mourning. While the Queen Mother's passing was more widely commemorated, given her advanced age and prominent public role, Margaret's death stirred a quieter, more complicated grief. Tributes from celebrities and friends painted her as a woman of extraordinary warmth once you broke past her royal barriers. They recalled her humor, her talent at the piano, and her generosity in private. Others reflected on how she seemed perpetually in her sister's shadow, searching for meaning in a life where duty consistently curtailed personal happiness. Now you might wonder, why does Princess Margaret's life still fascinate us today? A large part of it has to do with her role in blazing a trail. She stood at the intersection of traditional royalty and the modern media era. The controversies surrounding her romances, her divorce, and her flamboyant partying foreshadowed the intense public scrutiny that Princess Diana and subsequent royal figures would face. Margaret wore the burdens of that new era with reluctant pride, never fully surrendering to the monarchy's stiff protocol, but never wholly escaping it either. Her predicament resonates with anyone who's tried to break free from family expectations or cultural norms, only to find themselves pulled back by complicated loyalties. Furthermore, Margaret's story speaks volumes about mental health, particularly how the monarchy offered little space for open dialogue about emotional well-being. Her heartbreaks were dealt with behind closed doors, her despair often drowned in alcohol and cigarettes. Perhaps if the times had been more understanding, Margaret might have found a healthier way to address her inner turmoil. Then again, her rebellious streak was an intrinsic part of her nature, so it's impossible to say how a more permissive environment would have changed her. One lesser-known anecdote pieced together from private letters and recollections captures Margaret's inner world poignantly. In the late 1960s, after a particularly heated argument with Tony, she reportedly locked herself in a room at Kensington Palace and played a sad Gershwin tune on the piano, her eyes misty with tears. A friend who was present recounted that when Margaret noticed the friend standing in the doorway, she immediately stiffened, wiped away her tears, and snapped, "Don't you knock?" That tiny moment speaks volumes. She was a woman who felt deeply, but whose position demanded constant composure. The tension between those two sides of herself shaped every personal choice. Margaret's rebellious nature was, in many ways, a reaction to being second in line, second in importance, and second in nearly every matter that truly counted within the monarchy. Even if she'd never said so outright, it's not hard to imagine the toll that took on her self-esteem. Childhood friends often recalled how Margaret felt overshadowed, yet found ways to amuse herself and others, forging an identity through humor, style, and bold decisions. In later years, as Margaret's health waned, some glimpses of reconciliation with her more traditional family members emerged. She and Elizabeth, always sisters at heart, never truly fell out. They had their differences. The Queen was the archetype of dignified decorum, while Margaret was the free spirit. But they shared a bond shaped by childhood and wartime. Reportedly, Elizabeth visited Margaret often when she became ill, and they'd reminisce about their father, about the private jokes only they understood. That closeness in the final chapters of Margaret's life reveals an intimacy overshadowed by all the tabloids and controversies. In the end, they were two sisters who had grown up in the strangest fishbowl imaginable, forging an alliance that no outsider could fully comprehend. It's easy to dismiss Margaret as the scandal-ridden party princess, but that only scratches the surface. She was also a patron of charities, an accomplished pianist, a woman who loved fiercely and fell hard. She was witty, sharp-tongued, sometimes cruel, often kind, exasperatingly dramatic, and heartbreakingly lonely. In short, she was human, born into a life that left very little room for human error. If you find yourself standing at Windsor Castle one day, you might visit the memorial chapel where Princess Margaret's ashes are placed alongside her parents. It's a quiet spot, a far cry from the glitzy parties of Moustique or the bustling press lines of London. Yet in that stillness, you might reflect on how she finally rests close to the family she adored, free from the public gaze that, for so long, shaped and judged her every move. Though her official funeral was overshadowed by the passing of the Queen Mother soon afterward, many people who respected Margaret for her spirit, talent, and candor still mourned. Even now, decades on, you can sense in certain corners of British society a fond recollection of the princess who refused to be tamed. In the end, Princess Margaret's tale is as rich and multifaceted as any Hollywood drama. She was, in essence, a real-life leading lady grappling with a script she didn't write and often didn't want to follow. She yearned for love and acceptance, but found them challenging to maintain in the gilded bubble that is royal life. She used wit and rebellion as shields, protecting an inner vulnerability that only a few were permitted to see. And ultimately, she lived and left an imprint that continues to captivate us. Perhaps her greatest lesson is that behind every title, every headline, there is a person, one capable of laughter, sorrow, devotion, and regret. That essential humanity, so easy to overlook amid the pomp and scandal, remains the true heart of her story. Thank you for joining me in this conversation about one of the most enthralling figures in royal history. If you enjoyed this deep dive, feel free to share your thoughts and make sure you're subscribed so you won't miss more stories about the fascinating lives of those who step into or are born into history's brightest spotlight. Whether you empathize with Margaret or judge her for her choices, her life holds universal truths about freedom, love, and the cost of being a public figure. And that, after all, is what keeps her memory alive in our hearts and imaginations. Take care and remember, every legend, every icon, every princess is still a person at their core. And sometimes that very fact is the most compelling part of the entire story.